So Francois, okay, we're starting a new session. Francois, as soon as you're ready, you can begin.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, thank you then. Thanks for having me speaking with you. So I was asked to discuss the current status of neutrino transport in neutron star merger simulations. And so in this presentation, I'm going to start with a kind of brief overview of where neutrino matter in neutron star merger evolutions, then the kind of physical processes that we need to capture in order to properly model the role of neutrinos and their effect on important observables for neutron star mergers. And then after that, I tried to go through the different methods that have been used so far to model neutrinos in neutron star mergers, and hopefully without too much overlap with Chris's very nice talk this morning on Athena plus and the different radiation methods that are used there. Okay, so let's start with something that I'm assuming many people here are already familiar with. So if we look at the kind of the timeline of neutron star merger evolution, we try to figure out where neutrinos are going to matter. So during the early evolution before merger, neutrinos play basically no role. And then they're going to start mattering during kind of the second time scale during and after the collision. So when the two neutrons collide and eject material into the surrounding interstellar medium, then when you form a black hole or a neutron star surrounded by an accretion disk, which is going to potentially power relativistic jets, and nearly certainly also drive winds away from the remnant of a second time scale. And neutrino matter interactions are going to be very important to the thermodynamics of this remnant, as well as to the properties of the matter being ejected by the system. And that's going to be very important for observables because that matter that is being ejected then undergoes R-process nucleosynthesis with rapid capture of neutrons onto seed nuclei, formation of very neutron-rich unstable nuclei, and then their decay back towards stable elements, so with R-process nucleosynthesis. The energy released by the ashes of the R process as soon as the ejecta becomes optically thin to optical and infrared photons, then powers the optical and infrared kilonova signal on timescales of days to weeks after the merger. And we see that both the R process and the kilonova signal are very significantly impacted by neutrino physics and neutrino matter interactions. Right. The basic idea there for why the neutrino matter is that one of the most important determinant of the outcome of nucleosynthesis is the composition of the outflows, which in merger simulations we usually characterize by the electron fraction or proton fraction. And if you eject something that is very neutron-rich, like the initial neutrons are, and you look at the abundances of elements produced as a result of the R process, as shown in this plot from Jonas Lippuner and Luke Roberts, you end up with something like the black and yellow curve for again, very neutron-rich ejecta, where you form the heavier R-process elements above mass number of 120 or so, including the second peak and the third peak here and there, as well as the elements in between, so some lanthanides elements here and actinides over there, which are going to be important later for the kilonova signal. And then on the other hand, if somehow is going to be true neutrino interactions here, so if somehow you end up with of the order of a quarter of your nucleons being protons or more, and the exact number varies depending on the exact properties of the ejecta. But if you get somewhere around there, you can switch to no longer producing the heavier elements and get something like the blue curve here, where you produce the first and second peak of the R process and everything in between, but you don't produce anything above mass number of 130 or so. There is a transition between those two regions, of course. So that's one of the reasons neutrinos are going to be important is that they're going to drive change in the composition, and as if we want to actually understand the role of neutron star mergers in nucleosynthesis, we need to actually capture neutrino matter interactions properly. Then more on the observational side for the kilonova signal, one important consequence of these two potential nucleosynthesis results is the fact that the lanthanides and actinides, which are only produced by neutron-rich ejecta, have much higher opacities than the other elements produced as a result of the R process. That means that if those elements are present in the ejecta, it's going to take a lot longer for the outflows to become optically thin to photons, and there's a lot longer for the emission to be visible to us as a kilonova. You can see this on this plot from Dan Kaysen and collaborators, where from the black to red curve, on the left you see the bolometric luminosity, and you are slowly increasing the fraction of lanthanide, so those high opacity elements. So you can see the black curve as something like a very neutron poor outflow by neutron star standards. So at least maybe a quarter or a third of the outflows being protons. And then if you move towards more neutron-rich ejecta, you get something like the red curve. You see that the outflow, the kilonova becomes dimmer and longer-lived. And in terms of the spectrum, shown on the right at 4.5 days, it goes from being blue to being, well, optical at least, to being redder in the infrared if you go from, again, less neutrons to more neutrons, right? So that means that it's very good for us because we can actually observe a kilonova and get some information about the properties of the outflows, the type of nucleosynthesis that might be happening there, and from there, the properties of the merging compact objects, because different mergers are going to give you different kind of outflows. We're not quite at the point where we can do that reliably right now, but in theory, at least, that's possible, and that's something we would like to do better. Okay. So let's look now at the kind of the role of neutrinos in merger, and then we'll see what are the important processes to include in order to model them. The first order effect of neutrinos in merger simulation, or neutron star merger, is to cool the post-merger remnant. Both the remnant neutron star and the accretion disk are cooled mostly by neutrino emission. And so just to capture the thermodynamics of the remnant, you actually need to have that neutrino cooling included. And the next order correction due to neutrino evolution is the fact that the absorption of neutrinos in the outflows in the lower density region can heat that low density material, potentially drive outflows, although it's not the main driver of outflows, it's subdominant compared to magnetic fields. But more importantly, it changes the composition of those outflows, at least in the case of absorption of electron-type neutrinos and antineutrinos, as we will see. And that is crucial to the change in the electron fraction of those outflows, and thus the outcome of nucleosynthesis and the properties of kilonovae. Then maybe even to a higher order correction, if you want, would be that neutrino-antineutrino pair annihilation may deposit energy into the polar regions of your system. And that could help clear those regions of baryons and potentially contribute to the formation of a relativistic jet there. Also, current estimates of the energy deposited by pair processes indicate that it is probably not the main driver of short gamma ray bursts. You probably need a magnetic mechanism to actually power the jet itself. But it could certainly contribute to the dynamics of producing a jet in these systems. So neutrinos are definitely important to understand kilonovae and R-process nucleosynthesis, and potentially meaningful in the context of short gamma ray burst as well. So let's dig a little deeper now and look at the reactions that are actually that need to be included if you want to capture these nutrient-matter interactions. Looking even very roughly at capturing the first order effects in these systems. The first thing that you need to include, and that's pretty much every simulation, including neutrino in some form in mergers, do include are the charge current reactions for electron type neutrinos. So the two reactions on the top left here, capture of electron and positrons onto protons and neutrons, or the inverse reaction, capture of electron, neutrinos, or antineutrinos onto neutrons and protons. Those reactions are crucial because they are the main source of emission of electron-type neutrinos, in most regions at least. And they are also the reactions that drive changes in the composition of both the remnant and the outflows. So they are the ones that are going to be important for modeling kilonovae and R-process nucleosynthesis. And then in some regions, you might also worry about direct neutron decay, which is subdominant in most of the regions of the post-merger remnant, as well as modified Oka reactions were similar to these, but with a spectator nucleon. But currently in simulations, most simulations include the first two here, the first two reactions here in the calculation of the interaction rates. You might also worry about charge current reactions involving muon and tau leptons. But at this point in merger simulations, they are generally not included, even though the muon at least could potentially have some minor impact. The second type of reactions that you definitely want to have included in your simulations are scattering events, so scattering of neutrinos onto nucleons and potentially electrons. And the current status in simulations is that generally we include some form of scattering onto neutrons and protons and heavy nuclei in some approximate manner, typically maybe on some typical nucleus of a certain mass that is assumed given the equation of states. But there is some approximation that is being made in that most simulations so far assume that these scattering events are elastic and that the outgoing neutrinos is emitted isotropically in the fluid frame, which is not necessarily the case for these reactions. But the reason these reactions are important is that they are going to be one of the main determinants of the diffusion rate of neutrinos through your system. The main determinant of the diffusion rate for muon and tau neutrinos, and kind of at the same order as those emission and absorption reactions for the electron type neutrinos. The thing that most simulations at this point do not include, besides the inelastic part of the interactions with nucleons and nuclei, is interactions with electrons, so scattering of neutrinos on electrons. That's because those reactions are very inelastic and anisotropic, and that makes just the calculation of the rates the calculation of the rates is not necessarily much harder, but actually the storage of those interaction rates and using simulations is a lot more expensive than if you just include elastic scattering. So right now, most simulations do not include scattering on electrons, even though those events might be important for the thermalization of the neutrinos with the fluid, especially again for the muon and tau neutrinos, for which we do not include the charge current reactions. And then the third very important type of process that we need to properly capture the first order neutrino physics, I would say, are pair processes, especially pair processes for the muon and tau neutrinos. And here I'm talking about, for example, the positron-electron annihilation into neutrino and dineutrino and the inverse reaction, or the plasmon decay or nucleon-nucleon bremsstrahlung. Those processes for muon and tau type neutrinos are actually going to be a main source of emission because we don't include charge reactions. And so if we don't include these processes here, actually so far we don't even have any source of muon and tau neutrinos and dineutrinos. So we definitely need to include them in some manner. But they are more complicated to include accurately in your simulations because they involve two neutrinos. And so that means that any reaction for any of these reactions in whichever direction you go is going to depend on the distribution function of both neutrinos and antineutrinos. And most radiation transport scheme that we are using today either do not track individual distribution functions, but rather things like moments, for example, as we have heard in Chris' talk, or in the case of Monte Carlo methods, which actually do discretize directly the distribution function, might not have enough resolution to actually directly use the distribution function that we have in the simulation, or it might just be too expensive to calculate the rates exactly using the distribution function. Right? So in many cases, these reaction rates are approximated, assuming that neutrinos are in equilibrium with the fluid, which is kind of okay for the muon and tau neutrinos in dense hot regions because they are actually in equilibrium in the same regions, but is very approximate specifically for the case of the electron neutrinos because the electron neutrinos and electron antineutrinos might have very different regions in which they are in equilibrium. So one might be in equilibrium with the other is not. And that leads to a lot of complications in the calculation of the pair processes using this approximation. Practically, in simulations, most simulations so far include the pair processes for muon and tau neutrinos in some approximate manner, and either do the same for electron type neutrinos or entirely neglect them under the assumption that in most regions the charge current reactions are going to be more important anyway, and so maybe it's not it's better to just ignore the pair processes rather than making that approximation that the neutrinos are in equilibrium with the fluid in the calculation of the rates. Right. And then on top of these things, which I think are the first thing that you need to include in your simulations if you want to just get a rough estimate of the emission rate and the diffusion rate of neutrinos to your system, you might worry about additional effects such as neutrino oscillations or the neutrinos emitted during our process nucleosynthesis on longer time scale. Those things are usually not included in simulations so far. And probably not important to first order and the level of accuracy that we have right now for the second part. The oscillations as we'll see, might actually matter even very close to the remnant. But including something like oscillations would be even more costly in simulations so far. So right now, the merger simulations that we have already at our disposal either do not include oscillations or include them in a very, very, very rough manner. And I'll come back to that later. All right. So that's kind of the physical processes that you want to include in your merger simulations. Now, as Chris already mentioned, there's also a lot of difficulties in just evolving the actual transport equations. And that comes from the fact that Boltzmann's equations for radiation transport are high dimensional. So we would like to evolve either the intensity in the formalism that Chris was discussing, or what I'm writing here, the distribution function of neutrino, F nu, which is a function of time, position, and momentum of the neutrinos. And that's if you neglect oscillations. If you include oscillations, you need to evolve the quantum version of these equations, which is even more costly. And not only is it a high dimensional problem, but on top of that, you have a coupling between very different parts of the parameter space, between different momenta through scattering, between different species through oscillations and pair annihilation, and a very stiff coupling through the temperature and the composition of the fluid, which requires a lot of care in the time-stepping method that you are using when you jointly evolve the neutrinos in the fluid, as Chris already mentioned as well. Right. So in merger simulation so far, neutrino have been included in a variety of ways, most of them making some significant approximations in the treatment of Boltzmann's equation. Going from the kind of the simplest to the most expensive, we start with the leakage scheme, which is kind of order of magnitude accurate, and in the methods used in merger themselves, usually only capturing the cooling of the neutrinos. Then the moment schemes, which is an approximate version of Boltzmann's equation. Then Monte Carlo methods, which I'll discuss in more detail towards the end of the talk. And those are the ones that have been used so far. And then in the future, in merger simulations, we also hope to go towards things like the method that Chris was discussing, which is either a direct discretization of Boltzmann's equation through either spectral or finite difference methods. So starting with the leakage scheme, kind of the most basic method that we can include in simulations to capture the cooling of the system. The general idea here is that you are going to make two estimates for the energy lost to neutrinos in your system. You can calculate the emission rate of neutrinos, assuming that the neutrinos are free streaming away from the current point. That only requires knowledge of the local properties of the fluid. And you can, given an estimate of the optical depth of your system to neutrinos of a given energy, you can also estimate at the order of magnitude level a rate at which neutrinos diffuse away from the current point and thus carry energy away from the current point, as well as lepton number. Now, the free emission rate can be calculated exactly, at least to our knowledge of nuclear physics. And on the other hand, the diffusion rate is very approximate, in part because we don't exactly know in which direction the neutrinos are diffusing. I mean, to actually get the diffusion properly, you would need to do the full transport through the system. So most leakage scheme have some, calibrated formula for what the diffusion rate should be, which is calibrated to specific geometries. But when we go to the very complicated 3D geometry of a merger, this only becomes kind of an order of magnitude estimate of how much energy you lose. And then in between the very optically thick region where the diffusion rate is approximately correct and the optically thin region where the free emission rate is exact, you do some interpolation between the two, which is also going to be order of magnitude accurate. Now, at the base level, with just these methods here, you do not actually include reabsorption of neutrinos emitted at one point and reabsorbed at another point, which is going to have an important impact on the composition of your outflows. The leakage schemes are not very good as is at predicting the composition of the outflows. There are ways to go around that, which have been used in simulations of disks, for example, but they have not been used so far in direct merger simulations. Nevertheless, despite this limitation, leakage schemes have pretty early on given us some very useful information about the role of neutrinos in merger, starting with just giving us an idea of how much energy the system actually loses to neutrinos right after merger. So typically the peak neutrino luminosity, which is reached a few milliseconds after merger, is somewhere in the 10 to the 52 to 10 to the 54 ergs per second. And then that luminosity decrease on the time scales of tens to hundreds of milliseconds, depending on the mass of your system, and maybe a bit longer if you have just a stable neutron star remnant. And the other thing that we learned from these leakage simulations is that when you include neutrino cooling in your system, you actually do not get lower temperature disk. But instead, what happens is that your disk becomes more compact, but reaches kind of the same kind of temperature as if you did not include neutrino cooling. So the energy is basically lost to binding energy of the system. And what that means is that that more compact disk is going to be a lot harder to disrupt. You are going to have weaker disk winds with less mass ejection from the post-merger remnant once you include those neutrinos, because the matter is more strongly bound to your central compact object. All right, so going now beyond the leakage scheme and towards the moment scheme, which Chris already discussed in some details. So as a brief reminder, in the moment scheme, you take integrals of the distribution function or the intensity of neutrinos over momentum space, so for the direction of propagation of neutrinos. And for the scheme that we are using in merger simulations at the moment, you also integrate over the energy of the neutrinos in what is called the gray moment scheme. So this is not absolutely necessary. You could have an energy-dependent moment scheme. It would just be extremely expensive to evolve in merger simulations. Most of the methods used so far have used some version of a two-moment scheme in which you evolve the energy density and the flux density of neutrinos. And then, as Chris mentioned, you can derive evolution equations that look a lot like the fluid equations in conservative form, as shown here in kind of schematic form in the blue square here. Now, the things to note here is that in the flux term for the momentum density here, you have the pressure tensor of the neutrinos, the second moment of the neutrino distribution function, which we do not evolve. So you need a closure for that pressure tensor. And in the source term here on the right, which are the neutrino-matter interactions as well as some GR terms, the source terms are heavily dependent on the energy spectrum of the neutrinos, because most of the reactions that I discussed earlier, the reaction rate scale like the neutrino of the energy of the neutrino square. And so if you don't know what the energy spectrum of the neutrino is, you are going to have large errors in the calculation of the source term, which are crucial to couple your neutrino evolution to the fluid. Now, in terms of the pressure tensor itself, you can get a pretty good estimate of the closure in a very optically thick region, because there the neutrinos are in equilibrium with the fluid. And so actually the moment scheme are going to be practically accurate in the densest, hottest region of your system, where your closure, your approximate closure is actually pretty close to being exact. On the other hand, if you go far away from the remnants in optically thin regions, it's a lot harder to guess at what the pressure tensor should be, because it depends on kind of the history of the neutrinos, where they are coming from, the direction they are coming from. And the general assumption made in merger simulation so far is a closure of this type here, which is effectively assuming that all neutrinos move in the same direction far away from the remnant, which is fine if you are far away, because then the kind of your source can be approximated as a point source. But when you're in an optically thin region much closer to the remnant, it's a pretty bad approximation. And then in between, you have some sort of interpolation again between those two regimes in regions where your neutrinos are neither fully trapped nor fully free streaming. So you need these two closures in the moment scheme. You need the pressure closure and you need the energy closure, at least if you are using a gray scheme. And then on top of that, you need to be very careful again about your time stepping, because these source terms here are very stiff. And so you need to treat them implicitly if you want to keep your evolution stable. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these things imply in practice. But first, let's look at what kind of the success of the moment schemes were, because actually we have learned a lot about how much neutrino absorption impact the properties of your outflows from the existing simulations using the two-moment scheme. And that was from the very first simulation produced by Yoshiro Sekiguchi and published in this paper by Wanado and collaborators. The immediate result was that if you look at the electron fraction of the outflow on the left here, once you include some transport, for example, in the moment scheme, you end up with a much broader distribution of electron fractions. As a result, if you look at the abundances of R process elements produced, you produce basically all of the R process elements. This is not the case in a leakage scheme without reabsorption, where your R flows would be much more neutron rich and you would not produce much of the lower mass R process elements. Right. And as we see later, it actually captures that at least at the order of magnitude level. It captures the first order correction from the absorption of neutrinos pretty well already at the moment. But there are some remaining issues which motivate going beyond the moment scheme. The one on the left is the one that Chris already mentioned earlier, that if you shoot two beams of neutrinos at each other in the M1 scheme, instead of crossing as on the right plot here, which is what happens if you use the correct analytical closure for this specific system, which is not known in general for a merger simulation. If you use the closure we use in merger simulation, the two beam collide and merge as shown on the left part here. And this has been known for a long time now. In merger simulation, this specifically does happen in the polar regions, where you have neutrinos coming from everywhere in the disk that kind of come from different directions along the polar axis and merge. And you end up with an overdensity of neutrinos moving right along the polar axis instead of them crossing each other and moving past the polar axis. So that can have potentially an impact on, for example, your estimates for neutrino and antineutrino pair annihilation, which are very dependent on both the density of neutrinos along the polar axis and their angular orientation. But I actually don't think that that's the main issue in the context of the merger simulations, because that's already farther away from the remnant that it matters the most. I think the energy closure is a much more of an issue for us. And this an example of this is shown on the right here, where I show the composition of the outflows in two different neutron star merger simulation using different energy closure. Both of them fairly reasonable, I think, given the amount of information that we have at our disposal in the two-moment scheme. And the blue curve, the two blue curves shows you the result for the equatorial outflows, which are not very strongly impacted by neutrino absorption. So here there is not much of an effect, as you can see. And then the green curve shows you the polar outflows, where there is much more neutrino matter interactions. And you can see that just the change of energy closure, so change in the assumption you make for the energy of the neutrinos, can have a very significant impact on the electron fraction here. And so that to me tells me that we definitely need some sort of energy dependent scheme if we want to do better than this kind of errors here, right? This is already better than doing leakage by far, but it might not be enough to get detailed nucleosynthesis predictions from these simulations. Now, it is possible again to go to an energy dependent M1, but remember that we are doing implicit time stepping here. And if you do implicit time stepping with M1, with just gray M1, you have to evolve 4 variables per species. And in the standard implicit time stepping, you do an inversion of a 4x4 matrix at that point. If you were doing the energy dependent M1, all of those species, all of those energy groups are strongly coupled with each other, especially in the context of rapidly moving objects like in neutron star mergers, and so your evolution becomes very, very expensive when you have to do implicit time stepping for those maybe 80 moments or so if you have 20 groups. And at this point, at least, I'm not aware of a method for the moment scheme that replicates what Chris was mentioning for the full transport, the full discretized transport scheme, in which you can first do the implicit step and then evolve all of the moments. It might be possible to do it, and that would be great, and that would be one way to go to an energy dependent M1. But I don't think that has been derived so far in the context of M1 in general relativity. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is that you have to be very careful about exactly how you do your implicit time stepping and at what order you in the velocities you include all of the terms in your source terms if you want to properly capture the evolution of the system in M1. And that's not a failure of the M1 scheme itself. But that is a limitation of many of the schemes that exist, including the one coded in spec right now, which makes some approximations in the implicit time stepping in order to actually save computational time. And very recently, David Radice and collaborators actually did a very careful analysis of the implicit time stepping required for M1 with an implicit time stepping method that fully accounted for all of the terms in the evolution equation and that linearized the system around the correct point when doing these implicit time steps. And they found that there can be some significant effect on exactly how you do that implicit time stepping, especially in regions where where your neutrinos are trapped in a very high scattering opacity region. So the test shown here, which comes from David's paper, is the motion of pulse of radiation in optically thick fluid, optically thick in the sense of high scattering opacity. And the red curve shows you the correct answer, which is that the fluid, the neutrino pulse is advected with the fluid. The blue curve is the evolution of the M1 scheme with all of the relevant terms. And then the black curves make some approximation in the linearization of the implicit time step. And the green curve only takes into account the first order in V over C terms. And you can see that there are some pretty significant differences here. Exactly how much that impact the evolution of a merger, I'm not entirely sure at this point. I don't think we have a good estimate of that, but this is clearly something that could matter in merger simulations that we have to keep an eye on. All right. And then the last scheme that we have used in merger simulation so far is Monte Carlo transport. Very recently, we've implemented it in the spec code for merger simulations. The Los Alamos group has implemented it for disk simulations in post-merger evolution, and Kawaguchi and the AEI group now have implemented a more advanced Monte Carlo method, which they are planning to use, I believe, in 2D post-merger simulation. So a more expensive scheme, but one that will be more accurate than what I'm discussing here. The general idea here for Monte Carlo method is that you are going to sample the distribution function of neutrino using superparticles or packets. And then those packets are going to basically behave like individual neutrinos. They can be transported, scattered, absorbed, re-emitted, and so on. This is a very efficient method if you are trying to do a low resolution evolution of a high-dimensional problem with very inhomogeneous distribution function, which is exactly what we are trying to do here. And to show you how efficiently Monte Carlo distributes resources, I'm showing you here a vertical slice through a neutron star merger remnant, where you can see the number density of packets in our neutron star remnant. The red curve shows you density contour, so you have the neutron star at the center here. And you can see that most of your packets on this log scale are right on the surface of the neutron star or in the surrounding accretion disk, which is exactly where neutrino matter interactions matter the most. The disadvantage of Monte Carlo methods is, of course, that you are going to get statistical noise in your simulation. And they converge very slowly. So in the long term, I definitely believe that methods like what Chris was mentioning, full discretization of Boltzmann's equation is eventually going to be a more powerful method because it's going to converge faster to the true solution. But at the computational resource that we have at the moment, on the other hand, Monte Carlo methods are more manageable. So what are the main issues when you are trying to implement Monte Carlo in your simulations? Well, as opposed to the M1 scheme, which is very good in the very high opacity regions and then gets pretty bad in the low opacity regions where all those closures matter more. The Monte Carlo method is very good if you have low opacity region. It's very effective in those regions. And it gets a lot more tricky to use properly in the high opacity regions, in part because you have a lot of emission, absorption, scattering, which raises your computational cost. And in part because it is a lot harder to properly include Monte Carlo within an implicit evolution than it is to include M1 or a discretized Boltzmann transport. And I'll discuss a little bit some of the assumptions we make in spec in the next few slides. And then the last important drawback is that you have very different load balancing between your neutrinos, which are very concentrated in very small regions where the neutrino matter interactions are important, and your fluid and GI evolution, which are more equally spread through your spatial grid. And so you need a separate polarization scheme for your neutrinos, which from a bookkeeping point of view is definitely a complex problem to solve. So that's definitely increasing the complexity of your scheme due to the polarization issues here. So what do we need to do in order to properly capture the dense regions? Well, at the moment in spec, we are doing two approximations. First, when we have a lot of scattering events, we are mimicking that by assuming that a lot of scattering is basically just a random walk process through your system. And so you can mimic that by drawing from the outcome of a diffusion equation. And if you correct your diffusion equation so that it remains causal, meaning that neutrinos that will be predicted as moving faster than the speed of light according to the diffusion equation are just assumed to not interact with the fluid, And you make some corrections calibrated to experiments where you actually run all of the scattering events one by one, corrections, for example, to the outgoing momentum of the neutrinos. You can get a very good match between doing a this sort of diffusion approximation and actually treating all of the scattering one by one. So this is an approximation that actually I'm fairly confident works in the current setup, and it's pretty accurate down to optical depth of only a few within time step. The more significant approximation, I think, is how to do implicit Monte Carlo, or to actually evolve Monte Carlo without running into those instabilities in the coupling to the fluid. For that, there were methods that were developed by Flex and Cummings in the 70s, but they're not exactly what we are using at the moment. We make slightly stronger approximations at the moment in spec. The general idea of implicit Monte Carlo is that you can actually show that if you move some of the absorption opacity into inelastic scattering with the outgoing energy of the neutrino being drawn from the emission spectrum of the neutrinos, and you reduce the emissivity of neutrinos by the same amount as you reduce the absorption scattering of neutrinos, so that the ratio of the two remains the same, which guarantees that you keep the same equilibrium energy for the neutrinos. But if you do that, you just have a different discretization of Boltzmann's equation. That was shown by Flex and Cummings. Now, what we actually do in spec, because we don't have inelastic scattering at the moment, is that we transfer some of the absorption opacity to scattering opacity, but we use elastic scattering, for the scattering opacity. And that means that here we are actually changing the thermalization time scale of the neutrinos, because now these reactions that used to be absorption and re-emission are just elastic scattering and don't contribute to the thermalization of the neutrinos. So we change the thermalization time scale of the neutrinos from a very small fraction of a time step in these stiff regions to a few time steps effectively. And that has the desired effect of stabilizing the evolution of the system while maintaining the proper diffusion time scale and the proper equilibrium energy density of neutrinos. But it does slightly modify the equations in a way that does still converge to a true solution in the limit of infinite computational resources, but extremely slowly. Nevertheless, we have tested that this approximation at the moment, simulation does not have a significant impact on things like the luminosity of neutrinos, for example, that we observe coming out of our system. We have, for example, looked at a vertical at a profile along the z-axis of a neutron star merger remnant. And evolved that with a 1D radiation transport code where we can get the exact solution, and found that our approximation makes like sub% error in the luminosity, for example. Right. So that's kind of where we are right now. And just, I don't have time to discuss this now, but as mentioned, we also tested that our Monte Carlo code can for things like, for example, pressure-dominated shocks and the standard shock tube that Chris was mentioning earlier. One thing to note, however, is that doing shock tube with Monte Carlo is a lot more expensive than with discretized method. They're not very good at this kind of problem. Again, Monte Carlo method are better in the low-density regions than in the high-density regions where you do that kind of shocks. So it's possible to do it, but it's not particularly efficient. It gives the correct answer, which is reassuring, but it's not the kind of problem that you would want to do with Monte Carlo primarily. Right. And the other thing I wanted to mention is we have compared the Monte Carlo methods with our best moment scheme, and we have found that basically there is about a 10% relative difference between the two, which gives us an idea of the kind of error that we are currently making when using moment scheme. And I say 10%, it's in both the electron fraction of the alphas, as shown on these plots here, but also in the luminosity of the neutrinos, with the exception of the luminosity of muon into neutrinos, which has larger errors, because it is generally less accurately captured by all simulations at this point. So that's kind of where we are right now in our modeling of the neutrinos in merger simulations. And I think I'm out of time, so I will leave the open question. If I'm happy to bring them back, but I had some open question slide that might be interesting for discussions later. But otherwise, I'm going to leave you here and take any questions that you might have.
From the in-person audience? Are there any questions online?
I have a question. Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Can I approach?
Yeah, please come forward to the microphone.
Here's fine. I know. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Yeah, thanks for a nice talk. So you mentioned that multi-frequency scheme with M1 should be quite expensive. But is it in principle doable? It's just a
Yeah, so actually, at UNH right now, Patrick Cheong, who is a postdoc here within 3 years, has developed an energy-dependent M1 that is using both kind of in the core collapse context, in the post-merger context.
Mhm.
But the cost is such that he can run these simulations in 2D, but not in 3D at the moment. And that's because in some region he has to do a fully implicit time step involving 80 variables.
Right.
Right.
So my following question was how many like frequency beams you have to take into account to, you know, can you take just maybe 5 or or something like that?
I think 5 would be a bit low, but honestly, this is something that so far in terms of energy dependence simulations, all we have for the merger case is the 3 or 4 MC simulations that I published, I think, and they have run with 12 or 16 groups. And I haven't actually done a convergence test with number of groups yet because we haven't had the chance to. There are a lot of things to vary in the Monte Carlo scheme, and we haven't had a chance to make a full study of how many energy groups are actually needed. We based our estimates mostly on what was used in supernovae. And one thing that I know, and it is very important to be able to evolve neutrinos up to pretty high energy, like I'm saying 500 MeV. Because there are regions in your merger simulations that reach close to 100 MeV. And if you want to properly capture the equilibrium distribution of neutrinos in those regions, you need to actually go to maybe to at least a few hundred MeV. So you need to go to pretty high energy, even though your neutrinos that actually escape are only like 10 to 20 MeV mostly, right? And so that already puts a pretty strong requirement on kind of what you need on the energy space. Because if at the same time, if you want to go to 500 MeV and at the same time resolve the difference between the 10 and the 15 MeV neutrino, you need a decent number of groups, even on a Roche scale. But the more precise answer is we don't know exactly how many we need.
Let's just check that for a second.
I think there's a question online from Bruno. If no one in the room has any question.
We go ahead. Just a curiosity regarding the computational cost of these methods, like if you can comment on this, especially, I mean.
Sure. So leakage is very cheap. You know, it's a minor correction to the computational cost. M1, it depends a lot on how careful you are about your implicit time stepping. I don't know if David is in the audience or not, but in my case, at least, I know that it can be easily a factor of 2 change in the cost of the simulation if I do M1. So that's non-negligible. Monte Carlo depends a lot on the system you are considering. If I'm running an accretion disk around a black hole, the cost is actually pretty negligible. I can run with a few million particles and I'm good. If I'm running the system I was showing here, which is a non-collapsing neutron star, I run with 100 million particles, and it's a cost that is only slightly higher than my M1 scheme. If I do a collapsing neutron star, which is something we are running into now, we are noticing that we actually need a lot more packets to avoid instabilities in the very hot, very dense matter that's created during the collapse. And then it actually becomes, I mean, I don't have a final answer for you yet because I don't know exactly how many packets I need to have a well-resolved answer, but it's probably going to be a factor of a few more expensive, at least during the collapse time scale, which is not very long, right? But at least during the time that the neutron star is collapsing, you need more packets, and then you have a higher cost. But also to note is that these are pretty low accuracy simulations at this point on the Monte Carlo side. And Monte Carlo only converges with the square root of the number of packets. So if you wanted to get no sub% error in your radiation transport, Monte Carlo will be really expensive, like orders of magnitude more expensive than our current simulations.
Okay.
So Monte Carlo is good at kind of capturing all of the first order effects in the simulations and give you that very important energy dependence, which I think is crucial for the mergers. But again, I think in the long term, if you want to have very high accuracy radiation transport in simulations, methods like what Chris was mentioning, but adapted to actually time-dependent space-time will probably be better.
Okay, thank you.
But they're also expensive, right, for what we can do right now.
Okay, let's thank Francois again.